both leaders, they have something to gain from this. They are neighbours. You're never going to get away from that. And they kind of need each other for their security. And that was the case even before 2011. Um, so, I think it is in both of their interests, but both need to save face. That's one thing with their own populations. And, both have these really, really sticky sort of, problems that they need to solve. If Turkey was to pull its troops out of northern Syria and to just cut off the support to the political opposition, which is based here in Istanbul, and also to the armed groups, well, then you've left a vacuum right on Turkey's border, which has already got a huge amount of people, millions of people who've been displaced from other parts of Syria, living in refugee camps in that area. And you're basically opening the way for Assad's forces, with the backing of Russia, to just come back in there, and you're basically creating, another outbreak of violence on your border. Syria for a long time has been a proxy war, and Turkey and Russia have absolutely been on the opposing sides of that. I mean, they've almost been at war with each other through proxy. And there was a point, it was in late 2015, when Turkey actually shot down a Russian fighter jet on the border. I mean, there was a huge diplomatic incident. And yet, since then, particularly since 2016, Russia and Turkey have managed to move to this weird position of being quite close. And that's because of the relationship between President Putin and President Erdogan. They're quite kind of similar characters. It's also because Putin has, very, very cleverly played Turkey. So after that, the incident with the Russian fighter jet, Russia has put a load of trade embargoes on Turkey, and very quickly caused huge damage to the Turkish economy. And after that, then made up very clearly with Putin as the more powerful partner in that friendship. And Putin has used that to really create problems at the heart of NATO, particularly with the sale of the S-400 missile defense system, Russian missile defense system, to Turkey, which is still sitting in its box, by the way. Turkey spent billions on this. It's never been used. But I think, that wasn't Putin's intention. The intention was just to create this problem in NATO of having this NATO member, getting closer to Russia. Now, when it comes to Syria, Russia has a huge interest there. This is Russia's gateway to the Mediterranean, Syria. And it always has been. Going back to the Cold War, it was the same. But since the start of the Syrian war, and particularly since 2015, when Russia has come in on the ground militarily, its footprint there has grown and grown and grown. And, clearly with what is happening more broadly in Ukraine and the general kind of almost a new Cold War that we've entered in Europe, for Russia, having that base on the Med is incredibly important. Now, what Russia wants to do is to really consolidate its position in Syria. And for that to happen, it kind of needs to clear the board. It doesn't want the Turkish troops there, and it doesn't want the US troops as well, who are still present on the ground in the Kurdish areas. Now, pretty soon, I think we're going to see a US withdrawal one way or the other. They want out. But, what to do about Turkey? And, so it's no surprise then that, Russia has, for a really long time, been the outside country that's really pushing for this reconciliation.
And so there is a gauntlet to run then, almost, in that Russia and Syria need these troops to withdraw, but the last thing they then want to happen in place of that is for the conflict to, almost in a much smaller way, restart.
Yeah. And I think, you say restart, actually Syria hasn't finished. I think because it's sort of dropped out of the news, and because also as journalists, our access to Syria is so limited now. It's, not just because it's dangerous, it's just difficult to get the permissions to go into different places. So it's sort of fallen out of the news, but there is still bombing, there is still fighting, there are still ISIS cells operating. It is a huge security nightmare. And, that almost for Assad, it's going to be a real headache trying to retake control of these areas of Aleppo and Idlib, because they have been in opposition hands for more than a decade now. well, a decade, exactly a decade. These radical groups and other opposition armed groups are completely entrenched there. So it's really hard to see. And, it's not really in the interest of anyone to have another outbreak of really serious fighting in that area. So the question is, like, how do you frame a deal so that the Turkish troops withdraw and somehow seamlessly Assad retakes control? What we've seen in previous areas where Assad has retaken areas by force, so places like Derea, close to Damascus, Homs, these kind of places. What happened was that there were deals put in place that anyone who wanted to leave those areas could. They were put on buses, and they were brought to Idlib and Aleppo provinces, these very areas where there's almost a kind of Turkey's almost acting as a guarantor in these areas. And this is why these areas have become so crowded. I was speaking to a researcher earlier this week for this piece, and he made the point, actually, when you add it up, both the refugees who are in Turkey and the people who are in these kind of Turkish controlled or Turkish overseen areas, it's almost half of the Syrian population. This is a huge number of people, and these are people who are just not willing to live in Assad areas. So what can you do to persuade these people to go back? What do you do to persuade those armed groups to put their weapons down and make some kind of truce? It's going to be really, really difficult. So I think, even if in the coming months we see some kind of symbolic meeting between Erdogan and Assad, either in Damascus or in Ankara or in a kind of, third country where they do a kind of symbolic handshake, that's not going to be the end of it. It's not going to be as simple as it is with Sisi or with Mohammed bin Salman. It's far more complicated than that. Let's go back and talk about when they broke relations. So obviously the protests against President Assad in Syria started in the spring of 2011. And actually at that point, President Erdogan and President Assad were quite good friends. They'd actually holidayed together in Bodrum a few years earlier. President Erdogan and his diplomats were on this mission to create a kind of neighborhood, a Turkish neighborhood in the old Ottoman territories. So particularly, the Arab countries. And Syria was particularly important because it's also a neighboring country. They wanted to increase trade. They wanted to increase relations after quite a rocky time in previous decades. And President Erdogan himself, far more of a kind of eastward looking leader than Turkey had in the past. That all changed when those protests started. President Erdogan had already kind of framed himself as a supporter of the protest movements in the Arab Spring generally, and particularly the part of that protest movement which were Islamist and connected to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a global movement. It's an Islamist movement, and it's a movement that was banned in places like Syria, also in Egypt, also in Saudi Arabia, a really kind of feared movement in these old, more secular Middle Eastern regimes. But Erdogan very closely aligned himself personally with that movement. Also, several members, top members of his government, also very close to that movement. And he'd already, welcomed people like Mohammed Morsi in Egypt, who was the Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt until the coup of 2013. He'd supported the revolution in Tunisia. So it was a kind of very obvious thing for him to support the opposition in Syria. And quite quickly, when those protests started, and particularly when the protests became violent and Assad met them with violence, quite quickly the relations between Turkey and Syria were broken. So it was March 2012. Diplomatic relations were broken, diplomats were recalled, and Erdogan really wholeheartedly threw his support behind the opposition. We have to say, in his defence on that, he wasn't alone. Also, the UK, the US, Qatar, most Western countries actually were working together with Turkey to support that broader opposition. That kind of coalition of support didn't last very long. By the time you got to early 2013, you had the rise of really radical Islamist groups within that Syrian opposition. So initially Jabhat al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda-linked group, and then pretty soon after that, ISIS. At the point that they became a problem, countries like the US and the UK sort of started backing away, and then after that, moving towards supporting Kurdish groups in Syria, which was a huge anathema to Turkey, not just Erdogan, to Turkey generally, and to Turkey's security forces generally, because of course Turkey itself has its own Kurdish separatist problem. So Erdogan at some point becomes quite isolated in the way that he's supporting and the opposition, and particularly the parts of the opposition that he's supporting. It got to a point quite quickly where it was really only Turkey and Qatar that were left supporting the Islamist parts of the Syrian opposition. Um, at the same time, again, because Turkey is a neighbouring country, it was the major refugee hosting country right from the start, right from 2012, when really the protests metamorphosed into civil war, and particularly in those regions of Syria which border Turkey, so Idlib province and Aleppo province. These were the first areas in Syria to fall under rebel control, partly because of the help that they were receiving from Turkey and also from other countries. And by dint of their proximity to the border and the fact that they could get weapon supplies, that the rebels could kind of come to Turkey and use Turkey as a backstop. The refugees came into Turkey initially, and President Erdogan's government was very, very welcoming. They said things at the beginning like, these are not refugees, these are our guests, these are our Muslim brothers. And although there was always a part of the Turkish population that wasn't very happy about that, particularly the more secular part of the Turkish population who are against Erdogan, there were also parts of Turkish population who were, genuinely very welcoming and and actually still are. I've over the years heard countless stories from Syrians of the kind of support that they receive from their Turkish neighbours. But what has happened 10 years on, it was always meant to be the case that, the war in Syria would be over quite quickly. Erdogan was anticipating that Assad was going to fall, and probably that Erdogan was going to be quite a major player in the Syria that would come after that. Of course, that's not what happened. Assad has some pretty important backers, one of them being Russia and the other one being Iran, and they both stepped in different ways to help him out. Russia, in particular, after 2015, came in fully militarily. It brought its air force into Syria to help Assad in terms of air campaigns, launched an absolute campaign of carpet bombing in places like Aleppo. And Assad has stayed in his palace, and the refugees have stayed in Turkey. Now, at this point, we have about 3.1 million Syrians in Turkey. That's officially. So these are Syrians who are registered with the authorities. They live in the provinces where their registration is granted. So the Turkish government kind of knows about them. But then on top of that, you also have probably hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, and that's maybe sort of an overestimation, but certainly a lot of undocumented Syrians as well. So these are people who've come in across the border with people smugglers, not registered with the authorities, living below the radar, working illegally, and increasingly having to dodge the authorities. Now, the attitude of the Turkish people in the past few years, particularly in the past 5 years, has really turned against the Syrians. There's a feeling in Turkey that they were kind of missold what was going on, that this was a temporary situation, that the Syrians would be going back, and yet, look, the numbers have grown, and here we are, 12 years on, still with millions of Syrians. There are, certain neighborhoods of Istanbul where Syrians and other migrant communities, Afghans particularly, also almost make up a majority of the population. Also, if you go down to the Syrian border, some of the cities and towns there are now Syrian majority. So it's been a major demographic shift. And there's several things that sort of play into Turkish people's anger about it. The first, of course, is economics. Turkey is going through a really grinding economic crisis, which is mostly playing out through a cost of living and an inflation crisis. So, we have the classic thing. Turkish people feel that they are getting poorer. They see a huge amount of outsiders in their country. over the years, because there is a dearth of information coming from the government about exactly how many Syrians there are, what they're doing, what they receive. You find all kinds of misinformation about what the Syrians get from the government. Um, and then the second thing is to do with internal politics and to do with the opposition to President Erdogan. He is, by his nature, more Islamist and more religious than most of the Turkish population. And there is a sense, particularly among more secular Turks, that President Erdogan is trying to shift the culture and perhaps even shift the demographics of the country. Again, there is very little information, in fact, no official information about which Syrians are being granted Turkish citizenship. There are some. We don't know exactly how many. We don't know on what basis they're being granted that citizenship. So that leaves a huge vacuum for misinformation and for conjecture. So a lot of people truly believe that, this is a kind of project to shift the demographics of the country. And that's something that's been amplified by parts of the political class. There's a fringe party in Turkey called the Victory Party, led by quite a well-established nationalist politician. He's called Umut Özdağ. He split from his party and set up this party, and we can kind of equate it a little bit to, I guess, UKIP or Reform. It's a sole issue party. Its sole issue is send the refugees back, send the foreigners back. We don't want these people in Turkey. Now, the amount of the vote that they get is minuscule, but the effect that they have on the political conversation is huge. So Umut Özdağ and his party released a video last year before the national elections, and it was this sort of 20-minute dystopic story about what Turkey's going to be like in a couple of decades' time. And you've got this kind of Turkish family with this super educated kid wanting to go to medical school, and he can't because the Syrians have taken all the places and the Syrians are in charge. And it really, really had an impact. I mean, it can sound ridiculous from outside the country, but it really, people talk about this film, and people talk about, well, give it X number of years and we're going to be in the minority. So these are the kind of things that Turkish people are concerned about and are talking about. So this has become a real headache for President Erdogan because he is so associated with the Syrians in this country.
And the desire by Erdogan to mend ties with Syria, that represents part of a quite large shift that is going on, in which Syria is sort of being brought back into the fold in a way, almost reluctantly.
Yeah, both Syria and Turkey. So these are what I've talked about is President Erdogan's kind of domestic motivations. He wants some kind of deal with Assad where he will be able to basically return those Syrians and say, look, I've got a guarantee from Assad, they're going to be safe, so they can go now. But more broadly, yeah. So from the Syrian side, I think there's a general acceptance across the region that Assad is here to stay. He is not the leader that he was pre-2011. He's hugely weakened and he's basically a vassal leader, but he is still there. And will be for the foreseeable future. So last year he was brought back into the Arab League. Syria was kicked out of the Arab League in 2011. And also Turkey as well. President Erdogan had managed to kind of isolate himself from much of his own region because of his backing of the Muslim Brotherhood. And when the kind of tide of the Arab Spring turned, that left him really isolated. You had Sisi coming to power in Egypt, wanting nothing to do with him. You had the Gulf states, bar Qatar, wanting nothing to do with him. And that was fine, again, while Turkey's economy was going well. When Turkey's economy started going badly, all of a sudden he needs friends, he needs trading partners, he needs investors. So over the past few years, he's been on this kind of charm offensive, going around to rebuild relations with these countries, which for a long time he was very kind of vocally opposed to. It started with him going on a tour of the Gulf, building bridges with Saudi Arabia, particularly with Mohammed bin Salman, who had been a kind of regional rival of his. I mean, if you think back to 2018 and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate here in Istanbul, and the kind of rhetoric that was coming out from Erdogan and his government then, a complete turnaround. Also with the UAE, rebuilt ties there. and there have been promises of huge investments and huge arms sales from Turkey to those countries, which haven't fully materialized yet, I have to say. But the promise is there. And then earlier this month, a really big one, President Sisi of Egypt came to Ankara for the first time since he became the leader of Egypt. It was the first time in 12 years that there had been any kind of diplomatic ties between Turkey and Egypt, and they've re-established their ambassadorial roles. So yeah, it's part of this sort of general trend of Erdogan trying to re-establish himself in the Middle East, and also more broadly, also looking towards places like Greece, which Turkey's always had a very tortured relationship with. He's been trying to sort of build ties there as well. But Syria is the really difficult one because they are so entangled. As well as the refugees in Turkey, you have Turkish troops on the ground in northern Syria. You have those rebel groups that are operating there. Many of them are basically Turkish proxies at this point. You also have the issue of the Kurdish forces in Syria. Now, the Kurdish forces, that's another issue. Turkey sees the Kurdish control of that part of northern Syria as an existential threat on its border. It wants rid of that Kurdish control. That's one possible area where maybe Assad and Erdogan do see eye to eye, because also Assad having this sort of autonomous region within his country, again an anathema. But there are so many problems, and it's really interesting that Assad is kind of a pariah leader, far more than Erdogan, but it's Erdogan who's doing all the outreach. For the past few months on Turkish news channels, almost the same story on repeat. We're looking to build ties. Will there be a meeting? Will there not? And then you look in the Syrian press, and Assad's like, well, until you take your troops off my soil, no, there's not going to be a meeting. And really, I think both leaders, they have something to gain from this. They are neighbours. You're never going to get away from that. And they kind of need each other for their security. And that was the case even before 2011. I think it is in both of their interests, but both need to save face. That's one thing with their own populations. And, both have these really, really sticky sort of, problems that they need to solve. If Turkey was to pull its troops out of northern Syria and to just cut off the support to the political opposition, which is based here in Istanbul, and also to the armed groups, well, then you've left a vacuum right on Turkey's border, which has already got a huge amount of people, millions of people who've been displaced from other parts of Syria, living in refugee camps in that area. And you're basically opening the way for Assad's forces, with the backing of Russia, to just come back in there, and you're basically creating, another outbreak of violence on your border. And similarly, we can talk about, the return of refugees. I can tell you that the majority of the refugees here in Turkey are not going to willingly return. There is a reason why they're still here in Turkey. Some of them were actively involved with the opposition. But even, those who weren't, many of them might be men who, for example, fled their military service. They have that hanging over them. There are all kinds of reasons why people still, some of them just don't have a home to go back to. Their cities are so utterly destroyed that there is nothing for them to go back to. So how do you create, from Erdogan's point of view, how do you create, A, the guarantees from Assad that they can safely return, and B, the conditions for them to return? These are really sticky problems.